I like to always start with a quote. Another one from one of my favorite authors, D.H. Lawrence. Failure or success seem to have been allotted to men by their stars, but they retain the power of wriggling, of fighting with their star or against it. And in the whole universe, the only really interesting movement is this wriggle.
I like that.
I do too. So, that takes us to the theme of tonight's class. It's about wriggling. And the aspects very much represent that wriggle in a chart. That thing that we're either moving with or we're wrestling against. Now, what aspects are the geometric angles which the planetary energies form with one another as they are radiating towards Earth. What this appears like on the non-physical level, as we go back to that original image that I have at the beginning of the class, the man who's in two worlds, is in the astral realm. These forces coming together form vortices, which can be harmonious, constructive, or they can be like whirlpools. But they're basically creating these whirls in consciousness, in the non-physical realm. Now, what aspects do is they add energy to any chart. So aspects are very important, especially when we come to next week's class, where we look at astrodynes and how to use them in chart interpretation, because aspects form a good portion of the framework of those astrodynes. The other thing that aspects do is they add conditioning energy to a chart. And that conditioning energy is what we perceive as being favorable or unfavorable events in our lives. These are the events that either attract to us harmony or discord. Now, when we go back to the very first class, where we discuss an astrological chart as being a composition, we've already looked at the signs as the instruments, the planets as the tones. Last week, the houses were the auditorium, and now the aspects form the composition itself. And I had the great joy last night of actually going to a recital of an astrologer's work. Dane Rudyard, who was basically the father of humanistic astrology, Jungian astrology and transpersonal psychology, one of the founders of that, in his early days was also a composer, and actually in France and in New York, when he first came to this country, he worked as a composer. What I discovered last night in sitting through a piano recital was that Rudyard's music was as hard for me to understand as are his writings. This was a composition, I think it was his pentagram number 4, and it was something that, you know, being in the same era pretty much, or shortly after the period of Stravinsky, it did sound to me a lot like a bunch of pounding on a keyboard. Now, if I was musically trained, I could probably have far greater appreciation for this, and I could appreciate the virtuosity of the pianist who was performing last night. But astrological charts are like that. They are compositions, and to our ear, they sometimes sound harmonious, and they sometimes sound dissonant. So this is what the aspects do to the composition of the chart. This is what an aspect graph looks like when we're looking at a chart and looking at a computer-generated chart using the horoscope program designed by Paul Brewer. There are things that we need to know, and we're going to learn about the symbols tonight. But you can see in the graph, you have the symbol which describes what the aspect is. I want to show you how we read an aspect graph. We have planets going down the left-hand column of the graph, and we have planets going across the the top of the graph. Basically, they fall in order: Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, then the Midheaven and the Ascendant, out in that order. The graph allows us to look across and we can see what aspects does the Sun form with what planets. Now, you will see under the symbol of the aspect, there are two columns of lines. And the first of those columns represents the Astrodyne power of the aspect. Now, the power of an aspect, and we're going to talk about this more and more, because aspects lend basically two things to every chart. They lend energy, which we call power, and they lend conditioning, which is either harmonious, discordant, or neutral. What determines power, and we'll go over this tonight, is there are certain aspects which are stronger than others. Conjunctions and oppositions, for example, are the most powerful aspect. And parallels fall into that category as well. Semisextiles and inconjuncts are among the weakest of aspects. So, depending on the type of aspect, that adds a certain volume of power to a chart. Aspects which are applying have greater power than aspects which are separating. The closer an aspect is to being exact, the greater the power it has. How many of you would like to calculate that?
Oh, no.
Yeah, done that. So, the thing is, the Astrodyne does it for us and puts it in a neat little packet. So we're able to look at an aspect, and we can also look at the top line and determine exactly how much power that has. Well, then we can also look at the bottom line and determine how much harmony or discord that aspect has. More to follow. Okay, so we've already discussed this. There are 10 aspects that we work with in Hermetic Astrology. There are some astrological practices that have more than that.
And we have 10 because rather than more.
You know, it's a really good thing, but what I've discovered, it's a good question, Vicki. I've discovered that Zane really liked a adherence to a certain numeric symmetry in things. And 10, 10 planets, 10 aspects. 12 signs, 12 houses.
It seems like I can remember reading too where he said that through their research he discovered that a lot of the aspects that were considered really weren't that powerful to attract. Do you remember anything like that? That they weren't worthy of consideration, basically, is what I read.
Yeah, I think that was the answer in there, that he really settled on these particular 10 angles of, I don't want to know if calling them angles of interference or angles of interaction with one another, were the ones where you could actually record a specific type of energy expressing. So I wish I could give a more eloquent answer, but I'm really not sure, other than that was his researches is these were enough to deal with, and they could describe events. They could describe conditions. And 10 aspects is still a lot to work with.
Right. Well, wasn't he trying to keep it simple too?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's what we work with is called standard astrology. Hermetic astrology is standard astrology. Planet, signs, houses, aspects.
Right.
Keep it simple, sweetheart.
There you go.
Kids. Now, aspects range according to the volume of energy they bring into a chart and the volume of conditioning energy that they bring into a chart. What else adds conditioning to a chart? Any thoughts from previous classes in this series, or anything else you've ever learned?
Well, if it was fixed, movable, I mean, if the aspects make in 2 fixed houses, if it's a square, you know, that kind of thing, or is that what you're talking about, or planets?
Maybe houses.
Planets bring conditioning.
Like Saturn.
Venus and Jupiter bring harmony. Saturn and Mars bring, the rest are neutral. Signs add conditioning because through essential dignities, the planet falling in a sign can receive very slight amounts of harmony or discord, depending on whether that sign is a favorable position or an unfavorable position. You know, I always like to give the illustration, it's Goldilocks in the Three Bears house, trying to find the right place. And that's the way the planets react in different signs. So, there are 10 aspects, and what we're going to do tonight is go through each one of those aspects and try and describe it in a chart. The first aspect is the conjunction, and because in astrology we are working with a form of shorthand, I like to discuss the symbol. Now, to me, I mean, that looks like a little bomb, or somebody dropped their lollipop. But what it represents is when there are 2 planets moving down the same line of force, they express as one. And this is the nature of the conjunction. We call it a prominence compound. What does prominence mean?
It's big.
It's big or it stands out. I have a prominent nose. It stands out. A peak out in nature we might call a promontory. So a conjunction in your chart represents something in your character, in your personality, in your soul that's going to stand out in some way. Conjunctions are very hard to overlook. And the more time you spend around someone, even before you get to know their chart, when you do get to know the chart, it becomes really apparent to you what these conjunctions are, because they are outstanding traits. So, the exact conjunction is when you have 2 planets expressing in the same degree of the same sign. Now, with aspects, we have what are called orb of aspect. What we will be describing tonight is the perfect aspect, but every aspect has a little bit of wiggle room to it. And this varies in the width of what we call an orb that each aspect has. The orb varies according to whether or not it is a luminary. And what are the luminaries?
Sun and moon.
Sun and moon. Or a planet. What are the planets?
Mercury.
Everything else. Yeah. Yeah, basically everything else. But we consider the sun and moon as planets in astrology. We call them that, even though the sun is a minor star and the moon is the Earth's satellite. What happens when planets are in the same degree? They're moving along the same pathway or the same volition of force, and you're not able to separate out their characteristics from one another. They become married or united. So you can't stimulate one without stimulating the other. That's the nature of the conjunction. Now, we were talking about orbs. Conjunctions and oppositions have the widest orbs. And just so, just so you all can become really conversant with orbs, in your handouts, there is on sheet number 3 an orb table. These are Hermetic orbs. Now, orbs can vary when you study astrology depending on the school of astrology that you attend. Orbs can vary from size to size. In Hermetic astrology, we're very fussy. We're always trying to be as precise as possible, and therefore the orbs will be greater if we're looking at a luminary as opposed to a planet. The orb range is greatest if it's in an angular house, and it is smallest if it is in a cadent house. We always use the larger orb. So if there is a luminary in an angular house aspecting a planet in a cadent house, we go with the orb of the luminary in the angular house. Any questions on that? Question from?
This is Phil, Michigan.
Hi, Phil, Michigan. Would that be in Kalamazoo, Michigan?
He says, Christopher, should we use a progress chart as of today for this analysis, or the birth chart? My Sun and Mercury have moved into another house, etc.
This is actually a class on natal astrology, so put away your progress chart, and we're just going to concentrate on the natal chart tonight, Phil. However, some of the information that I share with you tonight will be applicable when you study progressions. The difference is, when we're doing progressions, we only allow a 1-degree orb of aspect, regardless of whether it's a luminary or a planet, what house the aspect is taking place in. However, in natal astrology, we can have orbs, which I believe the widest is 15 for a conjunction or an opposition in an angular house.
15. Yep, opposition
All right.
in an angular house.
And the smallest orb is, of course, 1 degree for a parallel, but after that, it's yeah, cadent, semisextile, or inconjunct is allowed only 1 degree orb. So,
Can I ask a question?
you may.
Who makes the decisions? That you said that Hermetic Astrology is very picky and they have a smaller orb than other astrological schools. So who makes the decision how big an orb is, and how come theirs is different than ours? Why aren't they like in math? 2 + 2 = 4. Isn't that the same kind of deal?
Well, and there's actually no one that currently makes these decisions. We actually teach out of a tradition, and in Zane's work with astrology, he is actually the person who came up with these orbs. And it was basically in the astrological research department. I do believe it was based on some predecessor knowledge that he studied, but Zane nowhere in the writings, he talks about, I learned this from my predecessor, but we aren't privy to who that was, so we don't really know what system he was educated in. But yes, Paul?
Well, the orbs, Ptolemy was sort of the first one to publish a set of orbs, and they sort of evolved from that. So
Yeah, and he did that, 1,800 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah, so the orbs have been around. There is some precedence for this, but there's nobody who's currently making up orbs.
Well, it's also possible that the orbs could vary according to the system, because they would have, they would weight the planets differently or place them.
Right, and I think the biggest difference I've seen is that in other systems, there is not a difference determined by angular, succedent, or cadent houses. They use the same. If they use a 15-degree orb for angular houses, it's the same for all the houses. So that's why there's a difference out there. And you too could start your own astrological system and determine orbs if you needed to have that power.
I just wanted to know, because it doesn't, I've seen other charts and they're different. So I just didn't understand. I thought it was like math, like it has
It's universal.
It had the
across all
same rules
systems.
all the time, no matter what. Like the ephemeris is the ephemeris, no matter what, kind of thing.
Right, and the only difference is, again, many of these systems are using the same aspects as we do, be it conjunctions, semi-sextile squares, semi-squares, etc. The difference is that they don't alter the orb according to the house in which a planet falls. So that's the biggest difference. So in our aspect table, you're basically going to have 6 columns, because we also alter the orb as to whether or not the sun or moon are involved.
And with Astrodyne, don't we consider Mercury too, as having the
Mercury
like
has,
sun and like a
has
luminary?
additional power as a luminary does. All right. So, in speaking of the conjunction is a neutral aspect. It is a powerful aspect. So, taking you back to your handouts, there is something else in here that I adapted from Catlin B. Williams' book on interpretation, chart interpretation, since it's no longer in print. And Catlin was a Hermetic astrologer, studied with Ed Dunn. And on the very last sheet, I have an aspect table for you, which will give you the name of the aspect, the degrees, the angles of degrees between 2 planets forming that aspect, a description of the aspect, how that expresses, what the key word is in Hermetic astrology, and what application is needed for any type of aspect. And then the nature of the aspect in terms of its power and conditioning. So if you go across the top of that list, you'll see the conjunction is formed by 0 degrees. It's 2 planets in the same sign, except when it's not. How else can a conjunction be formed? Well, you might have a planet at 29 degrees of Leo and another planet in 1 degrees of Virgo, and they're still going to be in conjunction. Or you could expand that orb out according to whether this is a cadent, succedent, or angular house. So sometimes you will have planets at the tail end of one sign, the beginning of another sign, and they're not really in the same sign, but they are in conjunction with one another. So, expression. Conjunctions are potent, intense, and powerful. They bring prominence to where they are in a chart. Look at your conjunctions. These are areas where you are focused, fixated, where you stand out in the world. What they require is temperance or control. The thing is, you need to learn how to do astrological rodeo. Because sometimes our aspects are like bucking bronchos, and you really have to get your lariat around them and wrangle them to the ground by the horns and get them going the way you want them to. So conjunctions are one of those aspects where, depending on the planets involved and the area of your chart, oftentimes you have to really work at developing that to get the best from that strongly neutral energy. So that's how you use this particular table. And when you start looking at aspects in your chart, just having this little cheat sheet is going to be so helpful in coming up with descriptions of how things are working in your chart. All right, so we've decided it's strong, it's neutral. What can make a conjunction harmonious or discordant?
The planet or
Saturn.
The malefics or the benefics are the only way you can actually add conditioning to this particular aspect. Any planet that's in a conjunction with Venus or Jupiter will have harmony added. Any planet in a conjunction with Saturn or Mars will have discord added. Is that clear to everyone?
Mm-hmm.
So, I can read this, but I'd be repeating myself. Okay, so here is a sample chart.
Whose chart is that?
This is the chart of Mahatma Gandhi,
Oh, okay.
one of my personal heroes.
Yeah.
I like it as a teaching chart, primarily from the perspective of alchemy, because here is one of those wonderfully discordant charts that some of us are gifted with when we're born, and somebody who was able to do a lot with it. Here's a conjunction. Mercury, go across, conjuncts the ascendant. Let's take a look at that. What I'd like to do now is start working with our vocabulary, because this is a class. The conjunctions basically, or I should say aspects in the chart, are very much like verbs. They tell us how an action is expressing in a chart. So we have here the intellectual thought cells of the soul, which express as perception, communication, expression. They are in a prominence compound with the ascendant. How would we describe the ascendant in a chart?
Personality.
The personality, the self-expression, the personal interest. So what would we expect to stand out about this man?
He was a communicator, a teacher.
Yeah, he was an instructor, he was a communicator. And if I remember correctly, I don't have my table of essential dignities, but I do think Mercury is favored in the sign of Scorpio? Is Mercury not at its harmony in that sign? Anyone
Well,
know?
it's at home in Gemini and Virgo. Be the
There's
sex-
exaltation in Aquarius.
Exaltation in Aquarius. Its fall is in Leo.
Detriment would be,
Its detriment is in Sagittarius, I know that well, and in not in Virgo, it's in Pisces.
I don't know whether
So I believe its harmony is
in
in
Scorpio.
Scorpio.
Well, you know, it's interesting because he's a very intense. I always think Scorpio to me is just very intense, but then he had that Libra desire to want to find the harmony and the balance, and that, but he was able to really communicate his form of going against taking that intensity of energy and
What
applying it.
does Scorpio want to do when you hurt them?
Get even.
They
Yeah.
want to smack you back,
Right.
and
Exactly.
better or harder.
Right.
And they will wait. It's like watching a Japanese movie
Right.
where by the end of the movie, the person who had been maligned, early in their childhood is able to come around and exact revenge on someone. Libra, on the other hand, wants peace at all costs, which was Gandhi's mission.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So he got even. He
uh-huh.
hung in there, but he
Yeah.
did it in his own way. His
yeah,
peaceful way.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think
He conquered the British.
He did. I mean,
the empire,
yeah,
the empire,
yeah,
he got even.
right.
But he was able to, and he did it in a calculated way. And it was done in a non-violent way. So that's the brilliance when you start putting all of this together. Really, how does this,
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's a conjunction in two different signs,
in two different
and so you have
signs,
to
yeah.
integrate those two energies.
Right, and I actually wanted to say, when we spoke about conjunctions in two different signs, they're very interesting to interpret because you do bring in the sounding board. This, although they're in the energies move along the same force, they're not being played on the same instrument. So you've got these sympathetic tones taking place, but on different instruments.
Is that kind of steel fist there in the velvet glove?
I like that.
Yeah,
Iron
very
fist
good.
and a velvet
Yeah,
glove.
that's what
Yeah. Mercury in Scorpio, conjunct a Libra ascendant. Packs a wallop, but doesn't leave a scratch. All right, here's another conjunction in this chart. I'm only going to focus on the major aspects. We will talk about each of the 10 aspects, but in terms of delineation, I think the major aspects are best for this class, and then semi-sextiles, semi-squares, sesquisquares are best saved for like a 4-week symposium on aspects where we can really refine our vocabulary. But let's look at this. This aspect is a conjunction of Venus and Mars. Look how high that is, 10.03. My guess is they're very close to one another, or in a powerful position. So if we look for that in the chart, it's here. 16 Scorpio 26, 18 24, just under 2 degrees apart in an angular house. This is power. Who would venture an interpretation?
Well,
A lot of magnetism.
there
Yes.
you go.
Animal
Animal
magnetism.
magnetism.
Oh, yeah.
Time out.
Renee asks, is this chart on the handout stuff?
I apologize, it is not.
And she wants to know if that's Libra on the Ascendant.
It is. This chart has a 25 Libra ascendant, and since you can't see it, let me just.
Talking about everything, too.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that
Right.
part. No, I didn't hear what you said.
Well, Paul said I could zero in on the chart, but you're talking about the
grid.
grid, yeah.
Well, and I'm also talking about the chart, so if you want to do a close-up on this section here, you can do that, and that will help them see. We have 25 Libra ascendant, 2558. Mercury's at 3 Scorpio 46 in the first house. Venus at 16 Scorpio 26. Mars 18 Scorpio 24. All of these are in the first house of the chart. And
It's got to be zoomed in. We can see it. They can't see it that well unless you're zoomed in on a full screen.
Well, I've got it centered on my screen.
okay. I will try and remember to send all of you a PDF of this. In fact, if you would like a PDF of this chart, write me, Christopher@light.org. And since only 5 people have responded to the question of the week last week, I'm extending your voting privileges another week in terms of whether you want a 2-hour class, an hour-and-a-half class, or an hour class. Thus far, 4 people have voted for a 2-hour class, and 1 person has requested an hour-and-a-half class. So that's the poll as it stands now. So if you want a copy of this chart as your premium, you must write me. I feel like public television. Send money.
You sound like it too. No.
Okay.
So he's magnetically animal.
Animal, magnetically animal. Yeah, this is somebody with charisma. Other people are really drawn to him. You have the aggressive urges and the social urges tied in together. So this is somebody who can get out, be in the public, make friends, or make enemies. But definitely will interact. Venus is 1/4 harmony, Mars 1/4 discord. What happens?
They wash one another out.
Yeah, they neutralize. They wash each other out. Let's see what we can see here. Look at the harmony and discord. That's a big fat 0. In fact, there's 3 of them. So the conjunction's neutral, and because they each bring the same amount to the table, they've neutralized one another. But this is a very powerful conjunction in the chart. And what I have found is, at least in my own studies, I probably have about 3,000 charts that I've done over the years with clients. Persons with Venus-Mars conjunctions are very charismatic, and they tend to really sway the public. You'll find them in the charts of saints such as Gandhi and sinners like Hitler. Both swayed the masses. I believe in Hitler's chart it was in the opposite, in Taurus in the 7th house.
I think you're right.
And then doesn't that Pluto,
Jupiter
conjunction, opposing all that, add quite a wallop as well?
It does. When we get to oppositions, we'll see if we talk about that. But here you have the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction. What does Jupiter bring?
Harmony.
How much?
Half.
Half. So look at this. This is not only powerful, but it is harmonious. So here we have the universal welfare urges, as I slur trying to say that, and must be the green tea, and Jupiter, the religious urges tied together in the house of marriage and partnerships. Gandhi brought a lot of partners to the table, and probably the most powerful was that of his wife.
So the seventh house is public though as well?
It is. And Pluto is groups and organizations, and he was very instrumental in the Indian National Congress and trying to bring together divergent groups such as Muslims and Hindus and Jains and Buddhists and the like.
Can I interrupt a sec?
You can.
When they left the room, she said, "How do I get the chart?"
Do you need to go
You
send
have
a
to.
chart to every, if I know who's there, I can go send them. Are you going to be using this chart throughout the this class, or different charts?
I'm going to probably use this chart throughout the evening.
I can go send it to them.
I'd rather
No.
that each person write me. They can have the chart
Okay.
later.
Okay.
And I'll describe exactly what we're looking at with degree and minutes and sign and house position. So that way they don't have to use their imagination and you don't have to leave the room. Another conjunction is that of Uranus to the midheaven. And where is that? It's right up there at the top of the chart. The individualistic urges are in the ninth house of philosophy, conjuncting the midheaven, which has to do with one's goals and ambitions. I am going to paraphrase a quote from Gandhi, but it's much to the degree that we must become the change we want to see in the world. What did he want? Change. And where does it begin? Starts at home. Each person does it.
Well, it's interesting. He brought about change. It's in Cancer, and he did it through his diet or through fasting.
Mm-hmm.
He did salt. I mean, salt was a big issue. I mean, he used interesting domestic issues.
Right,
on
with
which he
salt,
did-
as a colony, the British government forbade the use of any salt except for what they imported into the country so that they could gain through tariffs and taxes.
Kind of like tea in America.
Yeah, it sounds like tea, but not to give anyone wrong ideas out there. But nevertheless, it was a lot like that. So, what did he do? He marched a bunch of people down to the sea, and they made salt in India with their own seawater, and probably got beat up by the British.
Well, and that Uranus up there, I mean, it's in Cancer, it's Trine, the Scorpio, and I mean, it doesn't fight with Taurus, obviously. And I mean,
Uranus semi-sextiles the moon. It trines Venus. It trines Mars. It sextiles Jupiter.
Oh, yeah, right.
It does form a square to Neptune. It forms a sextile to Pluto, a conjunction to the midheaven, and a square to the ascendant. So it's involved in both a T-square that engages Neptune to the ascendant, opposition, and then Uranus forms a square to both. But it's also engaged in the trines to the Scorpio in the chart.
I mean, it's kind of his brilliance right up there on the midheaven.
Right. And I actually find that Uranus is seminal in creativity. Oftentimes we think of creativity as just being Venus. You know, let me decorate this room and fluff up this pillow and bring in some flowers and make everything pretty. But real creativity is when somebody starts to draw from different domains and blends ideas together and creates a form that is new and different than what was there before. And primarily, that is what Gandhi was able to do through his philosophies. Create a momentum for change that had not previously existed, at least on a widespread level in the world. There were people who practiced ahimsa or nonviolence, but not as a class, a class movement within a country. All right. What am I doing here? So, we're looking at them in detail. Social urges, prominence compound with the aggressive urges. Charisma. In Scorpio, sexy. Pluto conjuncts Jupiter. Here we have the universal welfare urges in a prominence compound with religious urges in Taurus. So this is a real pragmatism that's being applied. And through the aid of partners, 7th house. All right, the next aspect we look at, and I may have to talk a whole lot faster because we just spent 45 minutes and I've only gotten as far as the conjunction. I do believe a thorough understanding of aspects can take about 4 weeks of really working at it. So to try and jam it into 2 hours is really very difficult. All right, the semisextile is a growth compound. If you look at your cheat sheet that I've given you, the semisextile is when any 2 planets are 30 degrees apart, which is the equivalent of how many signs?
Yeah.
Yeah? 1. 1 sign apart, which means a planet at 15 degrees of Aries will be in semisextile with a planet at 15 Taurus or 15 degrees of Pisces, give or take whatever the orb might be. Now, the nature of the semisextile is very gentle. It is mildly harmonious. So, in order for this to really reap great benefit, the semisextiles in your chart, you really have to work. You have to exercise them. They are like underdeveloped muscles. But when they are exercised, they can bring about pleasant things into your life. So, careful cultivation to bring the planets involved in a semisextile into any type of full expression. Nevertheless, if you have enough of them in your chart, they can really create a lot of harmony, depending on how many you have. Let's take a look for a semisextile. Here in the graph, and I'm going to describe this for those of you who are watching online and are unable to see clearly. This is the moon forming a semisextile to Uranus. What that appears like in the chart is right here. We have Uranus 21 Cancer, the moon at 19 degrees of Leo. If we were going to go to our aspect table, which would be the larger orb, the planet in a cadent house or a luminary in an angular house?
Luminary in the angular house.
The luminary in the angular house. So if we look for that, the semisextile of a luminary in an angular house has as wide as a 4-degree orb. Of a planet in a cadent house, it has only 1-degree orb. And sometimes that will happen because you can have houses which are more than 30 degrees in width. And you can have a planet at the end of one sign, at any position in a sign, and still form a semisextile within that one house. And that's about the only time we get to use the 1 degree orb on a semisextile. Another semisextile is here. We have Jupiter, semisextile, Neptune. Neptune, 18 degrees Aries, 25. Jupiter, 20 Taurus, 10. There's a little less than 2 degrees difference. We're going to use the orb of a planet in an angular house or a cavant house to measure this.
Planet angular.
Angular house, always use the larger orb. So there's some opportunities, or I should say there's growth here between sixth house matters, Neptune, utopian urges, and religious urges.
Those would be harder for us to see, right?
These aren't the things that stand out and make the news.
Exactly, yeah.
This is the stuff that makes the news.
All right.
These are the things that, if you lived and worked with this man, you'd see.
Right, he had a very utopian work ethic, didn't he?
Well, yeah, he created utopian communities,
right.
ashrams, basically,
right.
where people from different faiths were able to come and live and work, much like a, in many ways similar to the Western model of the Christian monastic communities, mm-hmm. where people lived together in community and worked towards a common goal, a communal goal. I guess it's a different button. There's a semisextile between Neptune and Pluto as well. Also signified there. So again, these are not going to be the most obvious qualities, but these will be qualities that when you're in contact with someone, you get to see how they operate. The next aspect we're looking at tonight is the semi-square. Semi meaning half. Square, a square. So this is half a square. A square is 90 degrees. A semi-square is 45 degrees, which means that these are any two planets that are 1.5 signs apart. For the untrained astrologer and for the trained astrologer, these are oftentimes hard to pick out visually, because almost all of the other aspects, with the exception of the Sesquiquadrate, are falling in similar degrees. So our mind can go in and quickly pick out those. But when you're looking at 1.5 signs, it's a little bit more of a challenge, and that's why it's nice when the computer does it for you, or when you have an aspect finder. Now, according to your cheat sheet, semi-squares are mildly discordant. So they're manifesting in your life as uncertainty or vacillation. These are not the big cataclysmic disruptions that we have in life. These are the niggly little annoyances that come about in our life. Now, much like if you have a lot of semisextiles in your chart, it can make it overall very harmonious. If you have a lot of semi-squares in your chart, it can make it overall very discordant. What happens with the small annoyances in our lives? If we're paying attention to them, they can accumulate and grow. So with the semi-square, what you have to do, this is one of the places where you get to apply alchemy. And it's where you have to constantly shift your thinking into a more positive outlook between the matters governed by those planets. Because left to their natural devices, you're going to get cranky. Let's look for a semi-square. Let's find out how Gandhi got cranky. Oh, there's one. The sun and moon were semi-square. Moon, luminary, angular house, 19 Leo 57. Sun, 8 Libra 56. This has 2.02 Astrodynes and 2.02 Discordynes. Is this something that's going to really stand out? Not that much. However, because the moon is in a public house, it will. So one would guess that whenever the Mahatma was not being peaceful, somebody really paid attention.
Well, would you think that would mean that he really wanted to be off on his ashram somewhere, but he was called to be in the public all the time?
And this is more powerful. The moon is the dominant planet in this chart. So actually, his inner desires with the sun in the 12th house are, no, I don't want to live in a fishbowl. I don't want everyone looking in on my life. I want to live life quietly and peacefully and introspectively. And yet I have a duty to public service and to bring about change. So that can be annoying. Because, no, really, I'd rather meditate today. I don't think I want to go to your rally. That might be how that would express. Or do I really have to go out and give another speech about how everyone should be making homespun at home and developing cottage industries? You know, I think I'll just sit here with my spinning wheel. So there you have it. They're energizing one another. Can you see from these descriptions how the aspects really tell who we are? These are our idiosyncrasies that the aspects give to us. These are truly those little things of personality that those, closest to you know about. Another semi-square, Saturn to the Ascendant. Here you have Saturn at 12 degrees Sagittarius, 22 minutes in the second house of money and finance. The Ascendant we've already discerned is 25 Libra 58. How are you going to deal with that? Does Saturn in the second house want money? I would disagree. Saturn saves. Saturn wants to accumulate. Why? Some comfort in your old age. However, one of the biggest crises that I believe that Gandhi had with his wife was after the first strike that he coordinated in South Africa, and where the members of the community came forward and wanted to give her a set of jewels as a thank you, as a gift of gratitude for the work that he had done. What girl doesn't want a set of jewels, And he said, no. If we start taking things like this, there will be no end to doing things based on greed. Do you think that made him popular at home? It did eventually. Not that evening.
Right. Well, it's also in a grand trine, that Saturn is. So he probably reconciled all that pretty well.
Sagittarius to Aries to Leo. Yeah. I'm sure there was a way to be taken care of without it being big corporate gifts.
Well, maybe he had simple needs that were easy to care for.
Homespun.
Yeah,
I mean, the man wore a diaper,
Right.
basically.
yeah, exactly.
You know? And he slept on a bed that was string stretched across a frame, so, and had a vegetarian diet. So it was very simple needs. And so he probably always had enough. But does a Libra rising really want to live in poverty? No, they really like the fine things of life. I mean, you see photographs of him when he was a barrister. You know, he wore lovely English suits and dressed very nicely. But as life went on, he did assume this role of poverty, which, because this is a friction compound, I don't think it came on readily and easily. I think he had to change or grow. And the key word in terms of working with a semisquare is these are basically areas in your life where you have to build up your positive outlook.
And the growth, and if you do that, then there can
And you
be-
grow
then you-
exponentially.
Well, and
Yeah.
do you turn semi-squares into semi-sextiles? Is that how it works?
I think so. Or try and move them up a notch to a sextile.
That's not, there you go.
Oh, and here we are, talking about sextiles. Sextile means 60. And we call this an opportunity compound. Now that sounds good, doesn't it? We all like opportunities. So this is whenever planets are 60 degrees or 2 signs apart. This is a harmonious, and it is a powerful aspect, though it's not a really powerful aspect. But it is a, well, we'll call it mid-range. We'll say it's moderately powerful. And what it does, it brings the energies of any two planets together into a harmonious expression. The resultant end to all of that is usually good things taking place. The thing, unlike trines in one's chart, where the good can actually fall on you, sextiles have to be massaged into action in order to get their full benefit. Because the nature of the sextile is that left to its own devices, things are good. Things are functioning. Things are well. And oftentimes we don't move into effort except when we're experiencing pain. So if one can motivate themselves around the area of their sextiles without having to experience pain, then the amount of good one can do in the world has exponentially increased. So, basically, when you have sextiles, you have to develop them. One way to think of this complementary nature of a sextile is when you think of planets 2 signs apart, it means that they are in the same, for the most part. Again, we can be dealing with the end of one sign, beginning of another. But for the most part, they are in complementary elements. So planets in Earth will be sextile to planets in water. Earth and water are both feminine. Planets in fire will be sextile to planets in air signs. Air and fire both being masculine in nature. So it really makes for a very positive blending in these energies. Let us find a sextile. All right, for those of you online, the Sun forms a sextile to Saturn. What that looks like in the chart is the Sun, 8 degrees Libra, 56, in the 12th house, Saturn, 12 Sagittarius, 22 in the second house. Air to fire. The sun is the power urges of the soul. Saturn, the safety urges of the soul. One does think he would really rather have lived a simpler, quieter life. But he was swept up by the wave of the masses. The movement that was going on in the culture at that time. All right, another sextile. The moon, the domestic urge of the soul, or in a sextile with the ascendant. Here we have the moon, 19 Leo 57, the ascendant, 25 Libra 58. That's a fairly wide sextile, wouldn't you agree? Mm-hmm. That's not 60 degrees apart. We're looking at 66 degrees apart. So if we look at the power of that aspect, it's 1.97 astrodynes, and the same amount of harmony is added here because both the moon and the ascendant are neutral in a chart. But how might this affect him? Aspects to the ascendant are very important. Any thoughts as to why?
That's the personality.
Yes, it affects the personality. These are things that other people notice about us. So with the moon in Leo in the 10th house, moon sextile the ascendant, what would be noticeable?
His moods.
And the fact that he could be warm and congenial. The moon in Leo makes for somebody who's very concerned about manners, following protocol to some degree, and treating others with respect, kindness, respect. What did Gandhi do? I mean, India is a highly stratified culture. And depending on your parentage, that sets your position in life. Whether you're born into a Brahmin family, a Kshatra family, a Vaishya family, or a untouchable family. So what did he do? He renamed them.
I didn't know that.
Yes, the untouchables became Harijans, or basically the children of God. And his big effort was to break up the class system in India. That not only if Indians were to gain independence from a colonial society that was very class or caste oriented, he felt that Indians themselves had to throw off the caste system in their culture that so stratified their society. All that from a sextile. Here's another one. Oh, we just did that one. All right, another one. Jupiter, sextile, Uranus. What does that look like in the chart? Here we have Jupiter, 20 Taurus 10, retrograde in the 7th house. 21 Cancer 41, Uranus in the 9th house. Well, that, I would say, is pretty close. They're only, 30 minutes apart? Let's see what that looks like in terms of their Astrodyne power. Here it's 5.48 Astrodynes. This is a powerful aspect. And the harmony is, I can't read it, but I think it's either 823 is what I would guess. Could be 873. But this is due to the fact that not only is the aspect harmonious, a sextile, but Jupiter's involved. So we have religious urges combined with individualistic urges. Somebody who was basically reinventing things. And interestingly enough, he drew companions from all different faiths. And once when one of his devotees asked him, you know, what religion should I become? Should I become a Hindu? He basically said, well, what was the religion of your parents? And he said, oh, a Christian. He said, well, you should become a Christian. So he wasn't necessarily advocating for conversion. That the way the Uranus worked here was towards independence of separate faiths, but getting everyone to get along. Question, comment?
Phil, what does aspecting Midheaven do Venus Ascendant, I think it says?
I actually don't know what that question means.
What does aspecting Midheaven do Venus? Yes, that's Ascendant, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, the question that has come up on the screen does...
This, I think he's talking about this ascendant square. I mean, Venus rules his ascendant, so maybe that's what he's talking about?
That, or he could be asking about an aspect in his chart that we're not privy to in this classroom, so for which I can't really give an answer.
Tell him to try it again.
Yeah. Restate your question, please, and we'll get back to it. Because I'm sure it's clear in your mind.
Versus Midheaven versus Ascendant, I assume.
Okay. I'm going to pretend like I know what you're talking about.
I'm sure it was Venus.
And I'm going to assume that you're asking what's the difference between planetary aspects to the ascendant versus planetary aspects to the midheaven. Planetary aspects, these are the only two angles or house cusps in a chart that we measure aspects to. So, planetary aspects to the ascendant have an impact upon our personality and self-expression. Planetary aspects to the midheaven have an impact upon our career, our goals, and the way in which we are observed in the public. To some degree, it's how others see us and respond to us publicly, and the way in which we're able to get along or not get along with authority figures or superiors. But these are the only two house cusps that we calculate aspects to. So hopefully that was the question you were asking, Phil.
Yeah, that was it.
Okay. All right. Uranus sextile Pluto. I'm going to just keep moving because of time factors and not look at every single aspect. But I did bring these up. We've already discussed some. Sun sextile Saturn, power urges, opportunity with the safety urges. Religious urges are in an opportunity compound with the individualistic urges. Next aspect that we look at is the square. And I've already given you information about that, in that the square is 90 degrees. So this means that planets that are forming squares to one another are generally 3 signs apart. What this means is that they are found, for the most part, in the same quality. So, for example, planets in movable signs will be square to one another. Planets in Aries will square planets in Cancer or in Capricorn. Planets in Libra will square planets in Cancer or Capricorn. Planets in Taurus form a square to planets in Leo and in Aquarius. Planets in Scorpio form squares to planets in Leo and Aquarius. So these are basically 3 signs apart. They happen to fall in the same quality of expression. And the nature of the square is that it creates the obstacles in our lives. Although oppositions are a more powerful and a more discordant aspect, I find that squares are the greater challenge to work with. Squares in your chart are going to express much like life themes. You may feel you've already run that particular obstacle course, but once you get over the hurdle, there is another one in front of you, and another, and another. So it's something that tends to continue to repeat itself in a pattern throughout your life. It is dynamic, it is discordant, and it creates violent antagonisms within the chart. So these are usually areas of our lives where we are not at peace with ourselves, and where we interact with the world through those areas, we generally don't experience a lot of peace. The square requires constructive adaptation and determination to continually, it's kind of like a derailed train. You have to constantly pick it up and put it back on the tracks and send it to where you want it to go in order to make the best of this in life. So, do we have squares? As they say in Minnesota, you betcha. They got squares. Look at them. Here from the moon, I see 4. Moon squares Venus, moon squares Mars, moon squares Jupiter, moon squares Pluto. The moon is tied into
T-square.
T-square. Not quite.
No?
It's not, because they aren't forming oppositions to one another.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yes, they are. I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
Pluto is.
I'm
Yeah.
looking at a very strange angle here onto the screen. They are. These are T-squares. And the T-square is when you have planets in opposition, and there's another planet which is squaring all of them. As you can see, we discussed earlier being in the same quality. Here we have fixed signs. Pluto and Jupiter are in Taurus, fixed Earth. The moon in Leo, fixed fire. Venus and Mars are in Scorpio, fixed water. Do you think he had things to work on?
Just a couple.
Just a couple. And you can almost be guaranteed you will spend your life working on these things. It's like going through various grades of sandpaper as you work from really coarse to finer to finer to finer on polishing your character. So, those are 4 squares just to the moon alone.
So how would you delineate that? How would you set about delineating that? Would you do it from the perspective of the moon?
I would, because it's the dominant planet. And what I've discovered is, in an aspect, the more powerful of the 2 planets usually tends to take the lead. It's much like ballroom dancing. one of the couple takes the lead and is directing the other person around the floor. That's what the stronger planet does between two aspects. So in this case, almost everything is going to impact the 10th house of reputation, profession, public standing, relationship with authority figures. With all of those squares to the 10th house, my guess is he was a thorn in the side of authority figures.
He was probably a thorn in his own side.
He was.
Yeah.
He was, because this is a man who constantly experimented with diet
Yeah.
and with everything else that could possibly be a discipline to give him a more finely honed consciousness and the ability to do good in the world. One of these areas, Venus and Mars in the first house, how would that express through someone? Would they be highly sexed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially in Scorpio.
Right. But in other monastic traditions, like Christian monastic traditions, in Hindu monasticism, heightened sexuality is considered to be a deterrent to spirituality. It gets in the way because of all the things that accompany it. What can be jealousies, possessiveness, the amount of desire that one cannot always be focused on sex. And I think they've done studies, psychological studies, where I can only guess at the number, but I think men think about sex every 3 minutes, something like that. So,
Right, in high school or college.
Right.
When they're in class. This thought about sex comes up every couple of minutes, right? 2 or 3 minutes.
must be the surroundings. And when you're in a group of old people, it may be less frequent.
And Gandhi used to, you probably, are you going to mention the story about?
Yeah, he would sleep with the young women in the ashram, and I don't mean sleep in the sense of having sex with them, but he would go and lie in bed with them at night to see if he had not conquered desire.
And my thoughts about that were always, what the heck was he thinking about those poor young girls? I mean, it was a very self-absorbed.
Self-absorbed?
Self-absorbed and has no regard for his wife or how she felt about it.
Yeah.
Well, no, he would put a young girl in bed with
Yeah.
between he and his wife.
Oh my God.
Between he and his wife? Oh, I didn't know that. Well,
That's what I remember.
That would be the
That would be
opposition.
the opposition.
And here's the young girl. That's the T-square. There, we did a really excellent delineation. Yeah, things like that are also cultural. The relationship of man to wife in India is very different than it is here, from what I hear from Indian clients. And things like that done in this day and age. There was a man up in the northern part of the state who had a religious commune going on that was also using these techniques.
Maybe he had Mars and Venus.
Yeah, who I think is in prison right now. So certain things can be done in the privacy of your own home, but chances are, if you have a prominent moon in your 10th house, it will attract attention. It will end up being known.
Right.
Well, he's the one that wrote about them. In his autobiography, My Experiments with Truth, he described this as one of the experiments he was constantly practicing in life. But you can see the square is a dynamic compound creating struggle.
Oh, there must have been so much tension there with all of that energy.
I don't even want to think about it. So, we're getting down to the final half hour, and we still have a... I'm not going to go through all the squares. Let's see, though.
I'd say that's a
Isn't
discordant
there
chart.
Isn't there also a T-square between Neptune, the Midheaven or Uranus, and ascendant?
I think Neptune's sun, or Neptune ascendant Uranus. Yeah, there's another T-square. This is a highly discordant chart, and the perfect example of how one can rule their stars. And you will do all sorts of quirky things in your attempts to do that and to become a better human being. But this is somebody who made it his life work, was to, become the change that he wanted to see in the world. But just let's take a look. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares. I don't want to hear any whining from those of you at home.
Or in the peanut gallery.
Or in the peanut gallery. Yeah, just suck it up. If you've got squares.
Come on. If Gandhi can do it, we can do
9,
it.
sorry. Yeah, 9 squares. Dynamic chart. So that takes us back. I'm going to reread this quote again because I so love it. Bear with me. Failure or success seem to have been allotted to men by their stars, but they retain the power of wriggling, of fighting with their star or against it, and in the whole universe, the only really interesting movement is this wriggle. That's what I think. When one is beginning astrology, and depending on the skill of the astrologer you work with, we can be conditioned against expecting anything good from the squares in our charts, but it really is where the most interesting material comes forward. And let's go through this. We've already talked about that. That was fast. The trine. We want to move on to the luck compound. The trine is formed when any two planets are 120 degrees apart. This is 4 signs apart. And what this means is that these planets will more likely than not be in the same element. The trine is considered the most harmonious aspect in astrology. It brings abilities, favors, opportunities. It brings the things into our lives that come easily and spontaneously, and they feel really good. So, gratitude is the best attitude. If you want to have more of this, you have to be able to appreciate what you have. So when and where you have trines in your charts, you have to constantly work them. Much like the sextile. The difference between the trine and the sextile is the trine just sort of drops things on you. The sextile, you have to motivate it. You've got to turn up the heat under the pot and get it boiling in order to do something. The trines just tend to happen to you. Nevertheless, when one has such good things happening to them, they need to be able to recognize it and to appreciate it. And that then works to attract more experiences of the same nature. Moon, trine, Saturn. We know the moon is at 19 degrees of Leo in the 10th house. Saturn is 12 degrees of Sagittarius in the 2nd house. I do believe this man was able to attract in patronage, supporters. But by living in a religious community, in a communal situation, the money would not have been used by him personally, but would have been used to take care of the entire community that was present. And that's one way that he could overcome what might otherwise be the greed quality that could have become attached from this chart to riches. And Vicky pointed out earlier, doesn't that moon trine Neptune as well? So the utopian urges are involved with the domestic urges. When the moon and Neptune are in aspect to one another, this is something that can bring about great spirituality in the sense of the moods that one cultivates. Because this hardwires one for feelings of interconnectedness to the rest of life. And Uranus trines Venus, social urges, in a luck compound with the individualistic urges. New and unusual friends. And Venus trines the midheaven. There would be those who would really love him and do nothing but speak well of him and his works. And we have Mars forming a trine to Uranus and to the midheaven. And we have Saturn forming a trine to Neptune, creating this grand trine in the chart. So, we had in this chart 9 squares, and we have in this chart 7 trines. So, this is not completely a life of struggle. There would have been times where he was in the right place at the right time. And yes, it does take a certain amount of luck to overturn an empire. You have to have the right lever and fulcrum in order to do that. And post-World War II, the social climate in the world was ready for that.
It's like the whole Egyptian thing right now. That was just...
The time is right.
The time was right, yeah. Circumstances conspired.
All right, Sesquiquadrate. This is an agitation compound. Think of the old washing machine, and it had an agitation cycle. What does that feel like? Ka-thunk, 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 ka-thunk. That's what it goes like. So, this is whenever 2 planets are 135 degrees, or 3 1/2 signs apart. This is basically a square and a half. But it's not exponentially larger. It's not like having a square and a semi-square. It's much more similar to having a semi-square. Like the semi-square, Sesquisquares are going to be those areas of your life that, again, are not the burning urgencies, the really big complexes that you have. But they are that other sort of material that you get to work with that is continually annoying and makes you somewhat reactive. The Sesquisquare breaks up existing conditions. You know, it's like the bridge that just suddenly falls apart on you.
That's interesting.
And all you can do is cultivate graceful understanding. Be at peace. you have to figure out under, these aren't the huge events in life. You know, it's like going out, your pants rip, and you realize you forgot to wear underwear that day. What are you going to do?
Get yourself a long coat.
Yeah. And on your way to the coat shop, move with grace and composure.
Would fly.
And then ask yourself, how is it that you forgot to put on underwear?
Exactly. Chances are you won't do it again. Yes, we have Sesquile squares. And, oops, only one. Remembered the underwear because that's all he wore.
There's another.
It was a Doti. We have another, oh, you're right. We have the Sun, Sesquile square Jupiter. Thank you for catching that. Very good eyes, Vega.
I'm at a better angle than you.
Yeah, you certainly are. My neck's getting.
Yeah. Jacked up.
So, 2 Sesquile squares in this chart. Oh, let's try and delineate this since we've got one, and I think we have time. We have a Sesquile square from Saturn to the midheaven. Saturn, 12, Sagittarius, 22, second house of money and finances, to the midheaven, 26, Cancer, 06. Anyone want to hazard a delineation on this?
I think the whole public thing was probably an agitation to him.
How it affected his resources in the
Personal finances.
Yeah, and that's
away a lot of
excellent.
stuff.
It did, because he had to decide that if I'm going to be this public person, I cannot be the person that accumulates personal wealth. Because I'm out there to help so many others who have far less than I do. So he had to, and probably in the beginning, begrudgingly so, after time he probably experienced the great spiritual benefits of being able to flow material goods and services out to other people who were in need.
Wasn't it also that he had to sort of lower his own level? Wasn't he a higher case?
His father was a grocer.
Yeah, but wasn't it also that he had to sort of relate to the common man in order to get the common man to go with him? I remember that
Yeah.
from some story or another.
Yeah.
Well, he had a lot, he came from a more privileged background.
Right. So
Is
was
that
it
what you
saying,
mean?
yeah, and so
Yeah.
with this, I don't know if it's this, but
Yeah.
you know, just that's what it reminded me of, that Saturn in the second house.
But I also think it worked the opposite way. Because he wasn't from the Brahmin class, he was unable to get the support of some until it was so clear that he was moving forward like a juggernaut towards his goal that many people would come aboard.
This is a toughie.
Yeah, I would say inconjuncts are,
I've read more about
Or-
this than any other.
yeah, one of my least favorite to try and interpret. You know, it's something that's sort of between a trine and an opposition. So think of the movement of something that's expanding, and then it's like the arm of a catapult. It just sort of tosses it out of your life. So it looks like it's getting ready to grow,
Yeah.
and
Then it just
it goes on a trajectory, is sort of what happens. So it expands the matters between the two planets involved 5 signs apart. This is a weak aspect. It is a neutral aspect.
So it has to do with the planets that are forming.
Planets forming it really tend to impact this. And it's telltale influences within the houses in which it falls. And I would say, of the neutral aspects, the conjunction's really easy to delineate.
Yeah.
The parallel and the inconjunct, they're something that's much harder to sink your teeth in and to give a good delineation on, because they're adding energy in the chart.
It's hard to pin down an event. It's, or some specific.
Not by progression, though.
Yeah.
You will find events happen with your inconjuncts by progression.
Right.
And inconjuncts are sort of, for lack of better description, when things appear to be falling apart, they may actually be falling into place. That's kind of how the inconjunct works. It looks like something's being pulled out of your life, but something else remains behind, or something new is created that's actually a stronger form. And it's usually nothing that's ever really that major.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily the really big things in life.
But it requires adjustments, right?
It does. It does require adjustments. And because it tends to be so mild, there are also situations that cause us to cultivate or to develop our strength between those two areas. So I see the inconjunct as it brings about very temporary events in one's life. They may look like they're really something when they're happening, and then when you look back over it in the big scheme of things, it wasn't necessarily that big of a deal.
Mm-hmm.
So let's find one and try and interpret it. Venus, inconjunct Neptune. First house Venus, 16 Scorpio 26. Sixth house Neptune, 18 Aries 25. We're looking at personal interest, health, physical body. We're also looking here at health, the sixth house. Well, you know what he did all the time? In the attempt to become more spiritual, Neptune, he constantly experimented with diet. Gandhi was on a vegetarian diet. After a while, he decided to go to vegan diet, and he eventually started removing all pulses from his diet, basically beans, legumes, from the diet. And then he started fasting. And to the point where he nearly died a couple of times from the prolonged fast, much like in more recent history Cesar Chavez would do when he was doing his protest and or in general fasting for nonviolent change. So in this case, you can see an event that can pull something apart. In this case, what gets tugged apart in the long run is one's health. That type of extremism, even though the goal is spiritual, it has its impact. And there's another, Mars to Neptune. Similar aspect. And the Mars, I think, I look at Mars a lot as having to do with protein.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Renee asks, doesn't the inconjunct correspond to Neptune? Therefore, it is difficult to discern quality.
An excellent delineation, Renee. Yes. We do, to some degree, just as we lined up last week the houses to the signs of the zodiac to aid us in our interpretation, we can also line up the planets to the aspects to determine their varying, for example, Venus is like in nature to the sextile. Jupiter is like in nature to the trine. Mars is like in nature to the square. Saturn is like in nature to the opposition. The Sun is like in nature to the conjunction. Pluto is like in nature to the parallel aspect. So we can draw references between the planets, and Neptune is like the 10% planet, as we sometimes call it, is like in nature to the inconjunct aspect. And then it sort of promises a lot. It looks like it's going to become something, and then it just keeps on, the boat just sails on by you. All right, 2 more aspects to go and 10 minutes to go. So, opposition, separation, compound. Look at the symbol. I'm sorry, I forgot to focus on the symbolism with all of you. It looks like, barbells, or sometimes called dumbbells. But it's actually 2 planets apart. It's like the conjunction, only now you have another planet opposite it. So what happens in oppositions is you have 2 planets caught up in a tug of war, and they are just pulling at one another. And these create areas in our consciousness, areas in our soul, where we're usually at great distress with ourselves, because it's so hard to reconcile these competing and diverging urges. So, 180 degrees or 6 signs apart. Planets in Aries will be in opposition to planets in Libra. Planets in Taurus, opposition planets in Scorpio. Planets in Gemini, opposite planets in Sagittarius. You can go around the zodiac that way. It is less cataclysmic than the square, but there is a constant antagonism between the matters ruled by these 2 planets. And of course, the house position in which they fall also tells a lot. Oppositions from 1st to 7th house are tug-of-wars between self and others. From 2nd to 8th house, these are great conflicts between the personal handling of money and the handling of other people's money, one's credit and debt. 3rd house to 9th house are struggles between one's private thoughts and their publicly expressed opinions. 4th to 10th, between the urges of what one wants to do in the world and what one's family wants them to do. So we can go around the zodiac like that. The house positions really reveal where the conflict is taking place. I love this word, unrelentingly. 'Tis the nature of the opposition. Well, but it's so much easier to deal with in a square, because what you do to handle that is you must make choices in your life. And you decide between the 2 things that are in conflict with one another, am I going to live for self or others? You have to end up picking one, invariably. Or for family or for my own goals and career. Choose one. And then you move forward with that decision, and you can't afford to look back. But you will.
That's what I was going to say. Good words, Christopher.
But you will.
You just have to remind yourself. Yeah, you turn to salt if you do.
You turn to salt, yeah.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah. So, opposition, Sun to Neptune. These are very interesting oppositions. The Sun has to do with the self, the ego. Neptune has to do with either our more mystical sense, in the best quality of that, or our most inflated sense, in the worst quality of that. Persons with Sun-Neptune squares can become, oppositions, megalomaniacs. These are persons that may feel that their role in the world is so important. Now, there is never in his writings or in those who lived and worked with him where they described him as that. I think as a young man, he was very, very proud and very vain.
Well, he was sort of the king of his own ashram, though.
Right.
And that may not have...
That's a good point, because when you are in charge, you are in charge.
Right.
But that's a powerful opposition.
Right.
Oppositions of Sun or Moon to Neptune, though, also create great mystical tendencies in an individual. There's great sensitivity or great empathy that is felt.
So do you think he struggled in his ashram situation? Do you think he struggled between wanting to be the ruler and what he considered
And wanting
more
to be the
spiritual?
meditator.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But the other thing that happened, he was pulled away from his work and put where? He was in prison so many times.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't get my work done because I can't go anywhere. So it has to become inner work.
Right.
We talked about these oppositions. Venus opposite Jupiter. Venus opposite Pluto. So, we won't go into them in detail because we have 5 minutes. Vega's already packing. And
Sorry.
that's okay. But look at this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 oppositions in this chart. 6 oppositions, 9 squares, 7 trines,
Right.
and a partridge in a pear tree. All right, the parallel. This is the aspect I find hardest to delineate as a specific aspect. However, what I've discovered with the parallel, it's called an intensity compound. To me, parallels are much like having an amplifier on your stereo. And with parallel aspects, what they do is they crank up the volume of energy. Quite often, but not always so, you will have aspects involved in a longitudinal, planets involved in a longitudinal aspect, and in an aspect by declination, parallels being measured by the planet's position north or south of the equator. We have parallels. This symbol here is a contraparallel. That means north to south. There are some astrologers that delineate these differently from one another, but since I don't delineate them at all, it's the same to me. I just see it as, has the volume been tuned up or turned up in the chart? It's so hard to give some specific delineation to that, but we'll attempt tonight to do so. The more parallels in the chart, again, the more volume of energy is taking place. But it's oftentimes something that, and this is going to sound like a very vague and nebulous description, but it's almost more like in the spectrum of light. It may be more infrared or ultraviolet, or in the sense of energy more than being physical volition. It's almost a more unseen type of energy that's being expressed. The parallels in a chart, if you're using the horoscope program, all fall in the left-hand side of the chart. They tend to be powerful aspects, primarily due to the fact that we only allow 1 degree orb of aspect, regardless of where the planet falls, what house, and whether it's a luminary or a planet. So here we can see, oftentimes parallels are the most powerful aspects in your chart. Look at your charts and look for your parallels. 1309, parallel Mercury to the Moon. 1180, parallel of the Midheaven to Saturn. Let's do a Mercury-Moon parallel. We have the intellectual urges and the domestic urges in an intensity compound.
Mental capacity.
Excellent. It's like having one of those huge hard drives, if you have that aspect, in that your capacity for detail, acuity, and to be able to see the patterns in things and then communicate them. The moon is our more subliminal thinking that goes through life trying to sense patterns. Mercury's able to put that together and bring it into expression. And there's no hard aspect between these planets. If we look here, the moon makes no aspect to Mercury other than the parallel. And we know that this is a man who had incredible mental acuity. He studied as a lawyer in England, in London.
So would that Jupiter parallel with Mercury and the Moon, that would just expand it even more, right?
Yes, it would.
Make it more so.
And I would see this as Mercury parallel Jupiter, devotional thinking.
Right.
Jupiter parallel the moon, what happens is you expand your family. And his family went from his wife and daughters to suddenly all of these strangers he was bringing home to live with them and sleep with them. So there's some parallel for you. Now, let's move on because we're almost to the end of the class. I want to just go over this. Think of aspects in terms of their volume and their conditioning. Weak aspects are on the bottom of this line. More powerful aspects are on the top of the line. We are moving from harmony to neutral to discordant aspects. You can see the powerfully discordant aspects are the opposition and the square. The mildly discordant aspects are the Sesquiquadrate and the Semisquare. The powerfully harmonious aspects are the Trine and the Sextile. This being more harmonious than that, this being more discordant than that. And the mildly harmonious aspect is the semi-sextile. Why do we have more discord than harmony? I don't know, but I think Buddha said life is suffering. Neutral aspects. The powerful aspects are the conjunction and the parallel. The mild but neutral aspect is the inconjunct. Does that help all of you? Mm-hmm. Good. Quickly moving on. I'm going to go through this next week. Next week we'll talk about that when we do Astrodynes.
Okay.
And I'm not going to talk about applying or separating because they've actually been measured into the Astrodyne report. Back. Do we have homework? Oh, I guess no homework. Let me look in the notes because I actually think I gave you some homework. And if you don't want to try and enter this line, this Earl, in by hand in order to find the exams, I strongly recommend that you download at home on your computer the notes from www Church of Light TV. I'm hoping this is what you did rather than.
No, I punched it
No,
in.
you're an amazing woman. I am going to, hope I don't embarrass you, but proudly announce that Michelle got 100% on the first exam on the signs.
Yeah, it was
Gold
closed
star.
book.
Closed book?
Yes.
She's awesome.
No cheating.
So,
Good for you.
what you can do is go and make a copy of these notes, download them PDF form, and copy the URL, and then copy it over to the place on your Internet Explorer, and go to the exam and take the exam. It's so important for the brain to test ourselves. There are different elements of learning that are accessed when we do examinations of any kind, and closed book examinations especially. And this is basically what you're going to do. Whenever you have to sit down and delineate for a client, you're doing a closed book examination. You have to know this information. You have to be able to pull it up from the recesses of your memories and bring it forward. So the exams are so very helpful. Reading in Astrology and its Psychological Correspondences, Chapter 4, the Aspects. In Beginner's Horoscope Maker and Reader, Chapter 8, we consider aspects between each two planets. Those of you who have the Brotherhood of Light lessons, I also, since 2 chapters is just not enough reading to do in 1 week, I will suggest you also read in Horary Astrology, Chapter 1, Strength and Aspects of the Planets, and in Delineating the Horoscope, page 180 to 185, if you so happen to have those. And then, in your handouts, I have created a graph. And what I want you to do, and this is always such an insightful process, is go to your computer-generated chart, which looks like that, if you're Gandhi, and copy not the numbers which show power or harmony, but just go and copy the symbol over. Make sure you get it in the corresponding square, and put that in your chart, and look at your chart. And then, since the homework's so light this week, what I'd like you to do is with your keywords. In fact, now let's leave off this last portion. I'm going to have you do it with next week's homework, since you'll have a bit of reading to do this week. Any questions on tonight's class?
No, it was a lot of fun. It was great.
Yeah, aspects are really amazing things. They are the idiosyncrasies that make up our personalities, and they are the, when we go to read a chart, they are the details to a person's character. All right, well, it's great having you all here, and the really great news, or not such great news, is we have only 4 hours of class left. 2 hours next week, and then 2 hours on March 7th, I believe it is. That's our last class, or
Somewhere about that.
it's somewhere. March 5th, March 7th, I think, is a Saturday. Yes.
Phil voted for 2 hours.
Okay, 5 want 2 hours, 1 person wants an hour and a half. Okay. Vega, you're being outvoted, but you are free to leave at
Certainly
any
it's not the
time.
first time.
Okay, so there's only 2 more classes. Next week, we are going to be looking at, turn that back on, the Astrodynes, and how to use Astrodynes in our chart delineation. The last week of this class, we are going to go from soup to nuts in chart delineation, which is using basically everything we've learned over the previous 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 7 weeks, and putting it all together and looking at a chart.